Hello and welcome to this session in which we'll discuss the categories of fund balance. In order to understand the categories for fund balance, you need to have a good understanding about governmental funds, the 5 governmental funds. What are they? Specifically the one that use accrual accounting, which I'm going to list. And you need to be familiar with the elements of financial statements for the governmental funds. The governmental funds are as follow: the general fund, special revenue funds, debt service funds, capital projects funds, and permanent funds. In all these funds, they use accrual accounting. Also, you have to be familiar with the elements of financial statements for governmental accounting, such as assets, deferred outflow of resources, liabilities, deferred inflow of resources. And what did we learn? We learned that those are the assets, those are the liabilities. Assets minus liabilities equal to fund balance. And within the fund balance, we're going to have 5 categories for fund balances. Now, I just want to make sure you understand the overall what a fund balance is. Fund balance is asset minus liabilities, which is the same thing as net asset, because asset minus liabilities equal net asset. Matter of fact, in the past, we used to call it net asset. We used to call this fund balance net asset. That's no longer acceptable. Also, you need to know that the concept is the same for business as equity. Asset minus liabilities equal to equity. We cannot use the term equity because this is not a business. This is governmental accounting. Now, also, you need to know that we have a term called net position. This is not, we're not learning about net position. Net position also used in governmental accounting, but used for funds that use full accrual. The governmental fund that I have here, the 5 governmental fund, the general, special, debt, capital budget, and permanent, those uses accrual accounting. And for accrual accounting, we use, you guessed it, accrual. For modified accrual, we use fund balance. If we are using full accrual, like for proprietary fund, internal service fund, we use the term net position, or for government-wide financial statements. Let's go ahead and take a look at the categories of fund balance. GASB defined 5 categories to help us understand the restriction on these specific amounts. The first one is non-spendable fund balance, restricted fund balance, committed fund balance, assigned fund balance, and unassigned fund balance. Now, why do I have non-spendable in yellow, highlighted in yellow, and the other one are in 4? Another way to look at them are the 2 to 5, those are spendable. You can spend them. The non-spendable are non-spendable. So you can break these categories into one non-spendable category and 4 spendable. Now within the spendable, I listed them from the most restricted to the least restricted. So the restricted fund balance will be the most restricted. Committed will be less restricted than restricted. Assigned will be less restricted than committed and restricted. And unassigned is not restricted in any way, shape, or form, committed or assigned. So that's why I have them this way. Before we proceed any further, I have a public announcement about my company, farhatlectures.com. Farhat Accounting Lectures is a supplemental educational tool that's going to help you with your CPA exam preparation as well as your accounting courses. My CPA material is aligned with your CPA review course such as Becker, Roger, Wiley, Gleam, Miles. My accounting courses are aligned with your accounting courses broken down by chapter and topics. My resources consist of lectures, multiple choice questions, true-false questions, as well as exercises. Go ahead, start your free trial today. Starting with the non-spendable fund balance, this category includes funds that cannot be spent because they are not in spendable form. What's not in spendable form? For example, the government will have supplies, inventory, material. They cannot spend those. They're just not in spendable. Or they are legally or contractually not spendable. By law or by contract, you cannot spend them. Like what? Like if someone contributed money to the government and said you can only spend the interest on that money. Well, guess what? The principal, let's assume they contributed $5 million in principal. The principal cannot be touched. It's considered non-spendable. These amounts are not available, simply put, for appropriation, for spending. They are non-spendable, just by law or by their nature. We're going to start with the spendable fund, and this is the first one of the spendable fund. But guess what? It's a spendable but restricted. This represents amounts that are restricted for specific purposes. And who restrict those? External parties, constitutional provision, or enabling legislation. This could be creditors, external parties, bankers, people that lend you money, grantors, other governments, contributors, someone who'd like to contribute money, but they want to restrict that money. They want to restrict the use of it for a specific purpose. It could be restricted by laws or regulation of other government because they gave you the money, imposed by law through constitutional provision or legislation. So it's restricted for a specific purpose. For example, we have a law that collects taxes on food, and that taxes on food is to maintain the streets. It's restricted. The money collected is restricted. It's the most constrained category. It's the highest constrained category. We're going to go from restricted to committed. Well, this category includes amounts that can be used for specific purpose that are imposed by formal action of the government highest level authority. But remember, this is the government highest authority within the county, within the city, within the township. So it's the local government. The people who are in charge of the government are making those commitments. Because of that, those commitments can be removed, can be changed by the same formal action. If they voted, if the city council voted for that decision to commit the funds, they can vote again and remove it. So the city council, they can change their mind. They can change their mind. For example, they committed some money for a new community center. They can change their mind. They can redeploy the fund somewhere else by taking the appropriate legal action. If it's the voting. So simply put, those are contractual obligation. Yes, they are restricted by the highest local government, but there is no external force, no constitution, no enabling legislation is restricting them. It's the local government. Assigned fund balance. What's assigned fund balance? It's less restricted than restricted, less restricted than committed. This consists of amount intended to be used by the government for specific purpose but do not need the classification of restricted and committed. Well, remember, we have restricted is the most restricted. Committed is the second one. Well, if it's not restricted, it's not committed, but we use it for a specific purpose, it's called assigned. It's intended to be spent by the government highest level of decision-making authority or by body or official to which the highest level has delegated the authority. For example, the highest level usually is the elected people, but elected people will have management, will have people running the government. So those funds are committed by management. Like, for example, they will commit those in a budget. Those are called assigned. When I use the word committed in the wrong place because committed means it's more restricted than assigned, but simply put, management decide on how to spend this money. It's a lower authority. Think of it as a lower authority. So this is basically a residual balance of the restricted and the committed. So the funds are not restricted, not committed. If they're not both, but management is using them for something else, decide to use them for something else, then they are assigned. So simply put, it's a residual balance for not restricted and not committed. An example, the best example is budgetary assignment for contingencies or anticipated projects. So we have something in the budget. Once it's in the budget, it's considered some sort of an assigned balance. And it's easy to change because management decide on that. So we're going to go from unassigned to the best one, unassigned fund balance. Well, if it is not restricted, if it's not committed, if it's not assigned, and it's in spendable form, right? It has to be in spendable form. It's called unassigned. Unassigned means you can do anything with it. The residual classification of the general fund. It represents fund balance that has not been assigned to other funds, that has not been restricted, committed, or assigned for a specific purpose within the general fund. So the general fund will have the unassigned fund balance. This is the portion that's available for whatever purpose we want to do. This is where the politicians love those balances because they can do whatever they want with them. Okay, so now bear in mind, only the general fund, remember we have 5 governmental funds, could have a positive unassigned fund balance. Make a note of this. I'm going to show you why later shortly. Now, how about other funds? Other funds can have a negative fund balance. And when would they have a negative fund balance? When the expenditure in that fund exceeds the revenue. It means outflow exceeds the inflow. You will have negative fund balance. Otherwise, in the other funds, you're supposed to have a purpose for the money. It's not supposed to be unassigned. It's supposed to be assigned, committed, or restricted. Well, if it is assigned, restricted, or committed, and you have more expenditure than revenues, you're going to have a negative fund balance. Now let's take a look at this picture to determine which fund will have which categories of fund balances. Starting with the general fund, remember we only have one general fund. Could general fund have non-spendable? Yes, general fund could have non-spendable asset. Can the general fund have restricted? Yes, they can have restricted. Can the general fund have committed money? Yes, they could have committed. Can the general fund could have assigned resources? They could have assigned resources. Can the general fund have unassigned positive resource? Yes, they could have unassigned positive resource. So the general fund could have any of these categories. Let's talk about the permanent funds. Can the permanent fund have non-spendable? No, permanent funds, should not have any non-spendable item. They should not have inventory or supplies. Could they? Could, but they're not supposed to. Should they have a restricted category? Of course, permanent fund. Part of the permanent fund is you're restricting the funds for a purpose. The fund is permanent. It means you cannot touch the original amount. Let's assume someone contributed $10 million. It's a permanent fund. It's considered some form of restricted. It's restricted. That's why it's called the permanent. It cannot have committed or assigned for anything. It's restricted for a specific purpose. And it cannot have unassigned positive. It could have an unassigned negative, but not positive. Usually, it will have neither, usually. Capital project fund. Capital project fund is a restricted. It could have a restricted for a specific purpose. It's for capital project. It could have committed for a specific project. It could have assigned resources for a specific project. It could have those three categories. It cannot have unassigned positive fund. It could have a negative unassigned, not positive. Remember, the only one that could have positive is the general fund. You might be asking, could it have non-spendable? Possible, but usually those capital project fund, you're not keeping track of the project, you're not keeping track of the building that you are building or whatever project you are doing. It's funds. You are keeping track of the funds. Therefore, there is no reason for inventory or any prepaid here. The debt service fund. The debt service fund is restricted for debt service. It could have some money committed to pay the debt service. It could have some money assigned for the interest payment. It could have those three categories. It could have also negative, unassigned, only negative. If anything, it's only negative. Usually, it should be like not negative, not positive, but it could have negative. It could have negative, very possible. Special revenue fund. The special revenue fund is a fund that's being used to collect taxes, to perform certain activities for a special purpose. It could have non-spendable items. You could have, it's like a small business in a sense. It could have non-spendable item. The money is restricted for a purpose. So the special revenue fund is restricted. Now, the money could be committed for a specific purpose. Rather than restricted, it could be just committed, but it cannot be assigned, and it could have a negative unassigned balance. So notice, all the fund could have a restricted purpose. And this tells you what? This tells you that the purpose of the funds is to restrict the money for a specific purpose. You're creating a check account for each fund. That's why it could be restricted. Committed, all of them could have committed except permanent, because the permanent is the most restricted because it's for a particular purpose. No, if you want to look at it that way. And the general fund could have everything. I want to show you the Philadelphia annual report for the city of Philadelphia. It gives you an idea what we are discussing here, because it's very important to see what's going on. We have here the assets, we have here the liabilities, we have the deferred inflow of resources. Then we have those fund balances, and this is what we've been talking about all this time. It have non-spendable, restricted, committed, assigned, and unassigned. For example, here, the non-spendable, who has non-spendable? Other governmental fund have some non-spendable money. The general fund will have restricted, will have, for the general fund will have restricted. The health choices and behavior health fund will have also some restricted fund. The grant revenue will have restricted fund. Other governmental fund will have some restricted fund. Once again, they all could have restricted because the purpose of the fund is to restrict it for the money for a purpose. Notice here, for example, the general fund have some assigned money for a purpose and have some unassigned. They love this, the unassigned, right? Then notice the grant revenue fund, it has negative unassigned. Why? Because it has, when we computed revenues minus expenditure, it's more expenditure than revenues. We're looking at the balance sheet here, just so you know why we have a negative balance. We cannot have a positive. It could be zero, but not positive. Notice other governmental funds also have a negative unassigned balance. So just want to give you a picture of what it looks like in the real world. This way you can have, okay, now I understand this. Again, think of this as the equity section from a business perspective. Let's take a look at a multiple choice questions from Farhat lectures. That's going to help us understand this concept. What distinguishes the restricted fund balance from other fund categories? So there's something unusual or special about the restricted fund. A, it can be altered by the government highest decision-making body. That's a tempting one. It's the highest government decision budget. Must be the restricted fund. Actually, it's not. Because if it's imposed externally by a creditor or other government, even the highest government level within that locality cannot change it. So that's not the right answer, because if it's restricted by an outsider, the highest government authority still can't change it. It's used for the general governmental operation. It can be, but that's not what distinguishes it. That's not, it could be restricted for the general, could be, but that's not what distinguishes the restricted fund. C, it's restricted, so B is out, although B like kind of could be correct. It's restricted by external parties or laws for a specific purpose. This is a correct statement. What distinguishes, what makes it special, used for governmental operation doesn't make it special. But what makes it special is it's restricted by external parties, someone outside the government, or by laws for a specific purpose. There's a law. It's constitutionally, and that's how we have to spend this money. Then that's what distinguishes restricted fund. It represents resources not in a non-spendable form, not at all. It could be spendable. That's why it's restricted. It's spendable but restricted. So D is out. What should you do now? You want to go to Farhat lectures, look at additional MCQs. Governmental accounting is an important concept. If you're studying for your CPA exam, taking an accounting course, studying for some professional certification, invest in yourself. Good luck, study hard, and of course, stay safe.